I remembered. I don't know. I'm not trying. I'm not trying to avoid your question. I really don't remember. Yeah, I probably would have just said, yeah, it's a covenant. So just the benefit runs even in the absence of the horizontal privity. But I just don't think I can work that anymore. It's sort of unfortunate that I record all the classes because if you watched me last year, I'll probably say something inconsistent with this year. It's not because I'm trying to confuse you all. It's because I reflect on the stuff and I sort of try to get it right each year. In con law, I remember this one time I had a question in say 2014 about the Commerce Clause, and I said it was within federal power. And next year, reversed the exact same question, saying it was not, because I changed my mind. In fact, I remember some students made some pretty compelling arguments that, you know what, maybe I was wrong. So it happens. And they're like, you said this last year. I'm like, oh, leave me alone. It's I think it's a mark of progress if you can admit you were wrong. It's hard. Okay, but does everyone get this much? Now, the good professor did not respond to my last email seeking clarification. So let me just show you what I wrote from the last email, and that actually might help clear things up. So this is this is how I'm thinking about it. So I said, would you call it a covenant? I'm sorry, would you call a covenant without horizontal privity a real covenant law? Or is it merely a covenant in terms of contract law? So I always thought the very definition of a real covenant law was that the burden is capable of running so long as there's vertical privity. But if A and B simply make an agreement to restrict their land, they can do that. Without a transfer of land, they simply create a contract that binds only them. If B sells his lot to C, B effectively can assign its benefits as a matter of contract law. But it's not the law of real covenants doing the hard work. That's, Brian, if you ask my opinion, that's it. Is that yeah. Okay. We good with this? It's one other thing. You guys are good with rules. It fascinates me. This topic you're doing very well on. Other topics not so well. And I think just whatever reason, rule-based stuff we seem to do better on. When it involves like very intricate fact-based stuff from the cases, we falter. And I don't know what to make of that. Like I don't. It's an interesting section. So like the first couple weeks were a little bit bumpy, and now things are going a little smoother. We're doing zoning next week and takings, which gets a little bit harder in different ways. But for whatever reason, this topic seems to be clicking. So I feel somewhat positive about that. Yes, ma'am. It's already in the document, my friend. Yeah, I put it there before. If you scroll down, it's underneath the questions. You see it? Yeah, it's there. I put there. I think I did. Yeah, it's right there. It's under question 4. Yeah, that's how I think of it. And if you want to think of it the same way, you can. If you don't agree with me, then that's fine. But that's how I told it to the professor. Oh, I'm sorry, Jose. I didn't see you.
I think I just answered my own question. But assigning, so reading the last 2 sentences, if B sells his lot to C, he effectively can assign his benefit as a matter of contract law.
Yes, sir.
But it's not the law of real covenants doing the hard work. And in that scenario, the burden would not run to a successive buyer.
Yeah.
So essentially, you're just saying that assigning the benefit is not the same as
Yeah.
the burden running.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
That's the way I would say it. I don't think the benefit's actually running down to C. I think you're just assigning the benefits. It's the same thing in the end, right? It's the exact same consequence, just which law is doing it, the law of contract, the law of property. You'll see in this class that contract law and property law run together a lot. Like a lot of the doctrines we have in property law are actually contract doctrines. Contract law evolved much quicker than property law did in the 20th century. And you look at the restatement second of contracts, all this stuff, they incorporate contract doctrine. You probably remember this from property one in a lot of those cases. All right.
This would only be for mutually restrictive?
Yeah, not only, but primarily, yes. Primarily mutually restrictive covenants. It could work without. It could work with a regular covenant too, but this makes most sense with mutually restrictive. Yes.
So, in the sentence that Jose just read, if these are
Yes, sir.
As I look at the diagram, the benefit is on the side of confiscated.
The benefits of both sides.
Benefit of both.
Yeah, we're in the mutually restrictive covenant. This was Jose's question a minute ago, right?
Yeah, that's
we're in a mutually restrictive covenant in which both sides are benefit and burden. You could have it where it's the standard one, where it's only on one side, but it'll be a little bit different. That'd be more rare. Nick, does that answer your question? Okay. All right. How are you guys feeling about this? All right. we move on to the cases for today? Sure, why not? Hopefully remember it.
Subsequent bona fide purchaser,
Okay.
where does that start? Essentially, O to A, and
Mhm.
then A to B, but then O service to C. So we're talking about a race notice.
Whoa. Okay, you're going back. All right. So say it again.
So O to A,
Okay.
A to B, and then O to C,
Right.
right? But then C files first. Right? But then we're trying to figure out subsequent.
It was BFP.
Yeah.
Okay.
So do you start at stage 0? Is O able to be a BFP when it did to A?
You know what? I have an answer. Ask me after class. I don't want to. It'll take me a few minutes to get that one. Okay. All right. I want to go to the case. We have 4 cases. I want to make sure we get to. I'm not. Ask me later. Okay. All right. All right. Can we go on and do the cases? We have 4 days. It's a busy day. All right. So the first topic for today is creating covenants. Creating covenants. Right. And I realized my microphone stream wasn't working, so I fixed it. Everyone was texting you guys that they're watching online. To create a covenant, you must satisfy the statute of frauds. Covenants must be in writing and signed by the parties to be charged. Courts will not imply a covenant, right? You don't have like an implied covenant or a quasi covenant. The same we have a quasi easement. But courts will imply an equitable servitude. So in any question involving a covenant, if for whatever reason you don't meet all the the technicalities, the rules of covenant law, always fall back on equitable servitude, right? An equitable servitude does not need to be in writing. Remember, the 3 elements are a little bit different, right? You first have to have an intent to bind the successors, number 1. You need to have the covenant must, the promise must touch and concern the land, number 2. And number 3 is the biggie. There must be notice. Notice. All right. What kind of notice is required? It can be actual or constructive notice. And if you remember, constructive notice was a sort of umbrella category. Within constructive notice, you have inquiry notice and record notice. All right. And the first case today, Sanborn, illustrates the duties of notice on a person. All right. All right. Anyone want to give me the facts in Sanborn? Anyone? Bueller? All right. There's my friend down there. Fill it up.
I'll do it. Oh, this is the one. Oh. Yeah.
You get the next one.
Okay.
Good.
So this is one where McLean, Kristen McLean, independent, owned across other land in the Green Lawn subdivision, and it was on there had a dwelling house on there.
Well, just take a step back. How was this subdivision created? Maybe just talk a little bit that please.
Okay, so originally there was that had owned all the acreage that was there, and it ended up being subdivided.
Right. Good. And when the lands were subdivided, were there any covenants that were created?
Yes.
Were those covenants placed on some or all the lots?
All lots, I believe, initially, and then subsequently in each of the covenants, but then one of them, the one that's at issue here, it was not part of that.
Yeah, what a shame, huh? Yeah, the one that we have wasn't with the covenant written on it. Yeah, then what happened?
So then they wanted to use it to build a gas station.
Yeah, gas station. Yeah.
Yeah, wanted to build a gas station on their lot, and then the subsequent owners or other people around wanted to sue because they wanted to use it for residential purposes only. And so there was a equitable servitude or reciprocal negative easement that was placed.
I like how you just said that. Okay, so the language that the Michigan court uses was it reciprocal negative easement? That's not the usual language we'd use. I like what Lynn said better. Lynn said equitable service. I think that's actually the right language. Okay, so go on, sir.
Yeah. So there was an equitable service that was on that land that it runs with the land. It's not with the parties, the owners who are the first point buyers of the land. So carry the land regardless. And it arose out of the benefit afforded to the land retained.
Okay.
And,
All right, that's good. That's good. Let me pause here. Thank you. Thank you. It's very good. All right. So I found this little picture of a gas station. Gas pumps used to be very different, right? So now you think of like a gas station having these below ground huge reservoirs of gas. It used to be different. You literally have these little pumps, and on top will be a vessel. Maybe even may have glass. We just fill gasoline. So when you take the little pump, you're really pouring down water into the car. It's not very safe. It's not the kind of things you want in your residence, right? Because gasoline is very combustible, as you could imagine, right? So these weren't the safest things. Also attracts cars, it attracts noise, it attracts pollution, and everything goes along with the gas station. This is a case about notice, right? So Lynn said the facts correctly. There were a number of lots subdivided. Most of the lots had this covenant on their deed, but of course, the one lot that we have does not have the covenant recorded. If the covenant was recorded, this becomes a very easy case, right? You enforce the covenant, you can't build the gas station. But because there's no covenant in writing, you do not satisfy the statute of frauds. At that point, you fall back on our good friend, the equitable servitude. We ask our 3 questions, right? 4 questions, 3, right? Is there an intent to bind successors? I think so, right? One person subdivided the entire area and he put restrictions in every lot, but for one. That could have been an error or a mistake, right? I suppose you could argue he intended to bind every single lot, but this one, that would seem to defeat the entire purpose of the subdivision, right? If it's meant for residential usage, you need it to be consistent, right? You can't have a gas station in the middle of a one-family home area. Does this restriction touch and concern the land? Yeah, it does, right? It's telling you how you can't use your property. You cannot build a commercial enterprise. I'm sorry? Oh, bless you. Then we get to the third factor, right? Notice. Okay, notice. Again, there's several types of notice we've discussed. There's actual notice. Was there actual notice here? Probably not, in that it wasn't in his deed. But I think it's safe to say that, people perhaps told him about the covenant. We don't know. Okay, we don't really care about that, right? We care about what happened when when this case was being litigated. Then we ask, is there constructive notice? Constructive notice. And I think you could approach this in one of 2 ways, right? If you live in a subdivision, right, and you look around the block, and every single property is residential, that should make you start thinking, wait a minute, maybe this is a subdivision, like every subdivision that's restricted to residential property, right? You don't usually have a subdivision that's residential property except for one lot, right? That's rare. Casey.
Start searching back.
Oh, it's a lot of work, isn't it? Yeah. So that could be a reason why I think maybe this case was wrong. So Casey's question was a good one. So let's say you look around your neighbors, right? And you notice that everyone has a one-family house. So you go to your neighbors, hey, what's your name? You gotta do one title search. And you do the guy across the street, hey, what's your name? And then you do a title search, right? And you're doing 90 title searches by the time you're done? So that is a substantial burden. But still, the court says you're on notice to look around. There's also what you might call record notice, and this sort of goes to Casey's question a moment ago. Your own deed does not have this covenant in it, right? But you can trace back from your deed to the original grantor, the OG, right? The original grantor. That's what OG stands for. You know that, right? The original grantor. You're welcome, right? So you trace back to the original grantor, and then you find all the deeds that he himself issued. And you find that every deed that he issued back in 1890, whatever, had the covenant on it. Now, I don't know what's easier or harder to Casey's question, right? To go around and ask your neighbors, or to trace your title back to the original and then see what other deeds he may have handed out. Maybe the first one's easier. I'm not sure. But in either event, I think what the court's saying is, if you are, put it this way, if you choose to buy a lot in a subdivision, there's a very good chance it's subdivided for residential purpose only. You should have some duty of due diligence and not try and build a gas station in the middle of a one-family home area. Right? I mean, that's what the court's saying, right? We're not going to bail you out. In other words, if there was an error in the record keeping and the covenant was not placed on one deed out of 99, that's not going to bail you out, right? You were perhaps lucky or you were unfortunate, whichever one it was, but you're going to still have to do your due diligence to research further. Now, Casey raises a fair point, right? Isn't that a substantial amount of work? You have to go investigate to 99 deeds. Maybe not 99, right? Maybe after 2 or 3, you kind of get the picture, right? Or maybe if you go back to the original grantor, and then you could sort of investigate if he issued 10 deeds, all of them have this covenant on it, you know. And I think they're all done within a couple of years of each other also, so it's actually not that big of a time period. It was a fairly short period of time. Zach? Well, again, we presume the grantor grantee index is all you have, right? You know, realistically today, every HOA in the world has a website, and you can see, you know, this is a one for family homes, right? But I don't think that would work in the 1920s. No, it would not work in the 1920s. Correct.
That was the whole thing in that one case we read with I kept pronouncing the 2 words where the court held that it wasn't the duty of the buyer to go into the index to look at all the different names.
Adam Sonans.
Correct.
Right, that was the Adam Sonans case. Right. That was the case. It was from California. I'm blanking on the name right now. Was it?
Buyer.
Oh yeah, Orvie Buyer. Thank you, Orvie Buyer. Where the court said there's no duty to search every conceivable alternate spelling of a name. This one's actually easier. You know the original grantor because you bought it from whoever bought it from whatever, right? So you can trace up the original grantor pretty easily. And then you could use that to see what other deeds he issued in a fairly short period of time. And if you say, okay, in the span of 1 year, he issued like 15 deeds, all with this covenant, that's a pretty good chance that I'm going to be bound by an equitable servitude. Let me not build a gas station, right? That's a very risky project. And so in this case, the injunction was proper. I'm sorry, a little out of. Well, I think there's definitely inquiry notice. As you look around and you see the neighborhood, you'll notice that everyone's residential. I think you'd also make the point of record notes. This was to Casey's question a moment ago. If you know who your original grantor was, you could then see the other deeds that your original grantor issued and then figure out pretty quickly, okay, this is a residential subdivision. It's not as easy though. You have to do the record. Record's not. That's not even the case. That's just my sort of my opinion. You can disregard. Which apparently the editor of this case. I found typos with it. There are errors in the book. Did anyone notice? Not that you'll read the notes, but note 7 at Western Land. They removed that case. Western Land used to be in the book, and they removed it, but they left a note about it. No, it wasn't there. I know it wasn't there because it wasn't the stupid. Here, I'll show you the other email. This was in a different email. This is my note about Batten. But yeah, they included a note on a case that they removed. Okay, right. There was another actual typo in one of the cases where they wrote 1959, they meant 1969. Anyone notice that one? And I made one other editorial comment. In Batten, okay, this was a case about in Virginia with lot C-1A, lot 2A-C. Did anyone get confused by that? None of it mattered, right? None of it mattered. They give you this very complex fact pattern about 4 lots. None of it mattered. So what did I say? Here, I'll show you. You're welcome. I said, okay. Remove. I would delete. Oh, make this bigger, right? I would delete all the paragraphs about the 4 plots of land. Nothing will be lost. Students will not waste your time distinguishing lot 1 from lot C and blah, blah, blah. What did you write back? Excellent suggestion, Josh. I will incorporate. You're welcome. Okay. So anyway, so there were errors and things. But anyway, okay. All right, but yeah, so the lot note 7 was just it's the case they just deleted. All right, things I do on my weekend, right? This is probably you go home, you're relaxing on the weekend, right? No, you don't relax. You just work your tails off. I know. Zach.
You seem to get tired of responding to you.
Well, he didn't respond to my last email about the covenant. Well, look, it's useful because I'm proofreading the book for them. That's why it's useful, right? I get emails from my readers too where I make mistakes in my casebook, and I'm like, okay. Did you raise your hand? Uh, writers, I mean, he's right. Writers of casebook do not make much money. You guys paying, was it 300 something, almost $300 a book? I see a very small percentage of that when I write a casebook. It's striking how little we actually see. It's very little. It's funny. They actually were talking about adding on an author. Like, well, we don't add more authors because that dilutes our royalties. So basically, like Duke Minier or Kraemer, Alexander Strelowitz, like Duke Minier's dead, been dead for a while. Kraemer's retired long ago. Like there's only 2 guys who actually teach anywhere they're on the book. Yeah, Duke Minier's been dead for a while, and Kraemer retired some time ago. He's still alive. I don't know if the royalties go to the estate of Duke Minier. I bet they do. I bet he assigned the royalties to his estate. Yeah. Anyway, one of my colleagues actually had this idea. I didn't do it. He assigned his royalties to his children so that they would be taxed at a lower rate because their kids' income is much less. Whatever. I did not do that to my kids. All right. What else? Okay, let's move on then. All right. So after we talk about creation of covenants, we have to talk. Oh, Shelley v. Kraemer. I'm not at the termination yet. All right. So Shelley, have you all taken con law yet? Yes. All right. Did you all study the state action doctrine? Okay, good. I will give a brief recap in case it's not entirely clear in your minds, but I'll do the best I can. Generally, the U.S. Constitution. Oh, you all hear pocket constitutions handy? You don't keep one in your breast pocket? You don't? No, you keep it right close to your heart, right over here. Okay. Yes. You want one? Come to my office. I'll give you one. Come to my office. I'll give you one. I have hundreds of them. I always give you that to my con law students. You can have one too. 623, right after class. Come on up. All right. Anyway, so as a general matter, the U.S. Constitution only limits government action. There's. Do you know what the exception is? There's actually 1, 2, or perhaps 3 exceptions. Do you know what it is? Where the Constitution restricts private action. 13th Amendment. That's right. 13th Amendment bar and slavery restricts not only the government, but also private citizens. So private people cannot own slaves. The other exception is actually, it's weird, prohibition. But in some weird cases, if you violate a state law banning alcohol, you're actually violating the Constitution based on the 21st Amendment. Don't even ask me. It'll take too long to explain. But there's another one that I won't even get into. It's too complicated. Right, but usually the Constitution restricts only government action. And you can see that in the wording of the 14th Amendment. It says, no state shall deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. No state, which suggests that private citizens are allowed to discriminate on various bases. This principle was affirmed by the U.S. Supreme Court in the infamous civil rights cases. This case involved the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which prohibited segregation in places of public accommodation. Theaters, modes of conveyance, railroads, trains, boats, hotels, inns, and restaurants, the like. And so, wait a minute, Josh, they banned segregation in the 1870s? Well, they tried to. At least Congress tried to. It didn't work. There were a series of test cases where you actually had establishments excluding patrons based on their race. And no, this wasn't just in the South. You had theaters in San Francisco and in New York and other places. This was everywhere. Okay. And by the way, the violation of this statute wasn't just a civil penalty. It was criminal. You go to jail, right? It was a criminal violation to exclude people from your business on the basis of their race. All right. What did the Supreme Court say? That the Civil Rights Act was unconstitutional. That Congress could not rely on the 14th Amendment to bar private acts of discrimination, even if this was part of a larger effort to engage in Reconstruction, to bring the South back into the Union and to eradicate segregation and Jim Crow. All right, so Civil Rights Act was good law, except for the bans on segregation in public places. You wouldn't actually get a ban on segregation till the Civil Rights Act of 1964, almost 100 years later. So you study Katz and McClung, Heart of Lantham Motel, or Ollie's Barbecue, right? Ringing a bell. These were cases that upheld the federal government's power to ban segregation in various places of accommodation. But these cases were not premised on the 14th Amendment. They were premised on our lovely Commerce Clause and Necessary and Proper Clause. That is, people were articles of commerce, basically, or the channels of commerce, the instrumentalities of commerce, the food you eat, the tools you use in a restaurant, and so on. These are all things that can be regulated under the federal commerce power. All right. But that was 1964, right? And the Fair Housing Act was passed, I think, shortly thereafter. Our case today involves 1948. And just to put this into context view, in 1948, we're still 7 years from Brown's Board of Education, right? That was 55. Plessy, separate equal, was still good law, right? You can see this opinion sort of chipping away at Plessy, but they still have to sort of live under that ruling. Okay, so this was a case decided in the 1940s that doesn't have too much relevance today because of the Fair Housing Act. The Fair Housing Act is a statute that prohibits all forms of segregation, most forms of segregation in housing. Racially restrictive covenants cannot be enforced under the Fair Housing Act. But this was a very significant decision in the late 1940s. All right. Everyone get the con law angle. There's actually, I think, a very important property case as well, but the con law angle is just what people are sort of interested in. All right. So the case actually involves a block in St. Louis on Labadee Street. If you ever actually go there, you can see the house. Don't go inside. People actually live there. It's not a museum. I say somewhat facetiously, but like people always going there taking pictures. I'm like, someone lives there. It's a house. That's where they live, and they're not there to be museum people, right? They just want to live their life. True story. This is true. So we'll do a case later this semester called Kelo v. City of New London. Right? The case involves eminent domain. It was a very famous house. It was a pink house in New London, Connecticut, which was seized through eminent domain by the government. They actually moved her house brick by brick about a mile away, and they built it up from scratch. It looks exactly the same. Very expensive to do that. But one of the reasons why I mentioned that is they actually put a plaque, it's actually a boulder right in front of the house, saying this was a little pink house from Kelo. And there's actually a covenant requiring them to keep that boulder there as a sign to remember the case. There's also a sign saying, please do not ring the bell and disturb the people inside, because they're probably sick of, all the tourists like me coming along and wanting to see the Kelo house. So I didn't go inside. I actually walked up to the front, so like, oh, I'm not going to ring the bell. I'm going to leave them alone. So I didn't bother them. But then the rest of the story gets even better. Is the little plaque in front of the house. I was driving around the lot where they actually condemned the property, and I made a wrong turn. So here I am driving with my video camera out the windows, just taking pictures of everything. And I didn't really pull into the General Dynamics parking lot. General Dynamics is a military contractor. And I know what I was doing. I just made a wrong turn. And then this Jeep pulls in front of me. I'm like, oh, crap. I'm getting arrested today. And then so I pull up and the guard says, what are you doing here? I'm like, it's this big dude, right? This huge dude. And I said, what are you doing here? I'm like, I'm a law professor. I was recording footage of a famous house from a Supreme Court case. And he gave me a look like, who the hell is this guy, right? So I said, look, I'll tell you what. I'll show you my camera. I'm going to delete whatever's on my camera. I'll show it to you. I don't want any pictures of your facility. I promise it was an accident. He went back to his Jeep. Again, I was blocked. I couldn't even move. And he came back and said, all right, fine. Delete what's on your camera. I did that, cleaned it out, wiped the memory card. He's like, fine, you can leave. So the things I do for my students, right? But anyway, if you ever go there, don't knock on their door. They're just living there trying to, just be peace and quiet.
He probably thought you were doing the First Amendment auto.
He did. He thought I was a protester trying to, do some environmental stuff to me, right? Right. If you just Google me, sorry, that's fine, Josh. You can go. It's like,
Like a copy of the Constitution.
if I had one, I've given it to him. I was like, really, I'm not the guy you're worrying about. You know, okay, a Greenpeace guy, you know, that's like,
Was he been aware of the Shelley?
no, of course not. He was security, but he was a big guy in a Jeep and he was scary. I thought I was gonna get arrested. I thought I was like, okay, I'm going to jail today. I've never been to jail before. No, this was an old school camcorder. I actually deleted it with a memory card. There wasn't even, there's no cloud. Oh man, if there was a cloud, that would have been even worse. Okay, you'll be my lawyer. I'll call you up, right? Although, I mean, this is actually another time. So this was back in 2008. I was doing I was monitoring the polls during the election, and then someone accused me of taking pictures on my phone of people voting. And thank God my BlackBerry didn't have a camera. So it was like, he was taking pictures. Like, look, the phone has no camera on it. This is 2008. So I saved again. But yeah, today would be the cloud in 5 seconds. Live streaming it. Like, go live. Like, look, here's the house. Then I probably gone to jail. All right. So the facts of this case, right? We'll get to the racial component in a minute. I want to talk about the property component for now, right? On this neighborhood, there were 57 parcels of land, right? And then a group of 30 neighbors who owned about 47 of the lots agreed to put what's called a racially restrictive covenant on the property. That is, I'll read you. People of the Negro or Mongolian race can't live there for 50 years, right? These are very common. I promise if you check title searches for people in your family, you'll find these on the properties. I promise they're there. 3 of the justices of the Supreme Court had these on their properties. They recused. The vote was 6-0. Okay. So let's just look at this from a property perspective. You have 57 lots, and the owners of 47 of them just reach an agreement to impose a covenant. Is this a valid covenant? No. Why not? What's lacking? There's no horizontal privity. I mean, I know it sounds stupid, right? The Supreme Court's not going to do this massive case on race based on horizontal privity, but straight up, under property law, they lose. Right? Under property law, there is no restrictive covenant here. There cannot be, because there's no horizontal privity. In fact, my exam question a couple of years ago was basically this case, but I said, forget the 14th Amendment, just do it straight on property, right? So first off, is there an intent to bind successors? Well, some of them, yeah, those who agreed, but a number of the families didn't sign it. And some of those families had Black residents who did not agree to this agreement. So that, number one's fail. Number two, did the promise touch and concern the land? I don't see how, right? Who lives there is not a restriction on how you can use the property. So historically, at common law, the color of the skin of the person living there would not touch and concern the land in any way, shape, or form. Under Neponsit, though, maybe, probably, I don't know. Neponsit was pretty broad. Did Neponsit allow racist, exclusion? Maybe, I don't know. But I think under common law, no way this works on touch and concern. And then again, number three, is there privity of estate? No way. They just reach this agreement on their own, just neighbors. So what I'm trying to tell you is, for a real covenant law, there is no burden to run here, right? The burden cannot run here under a real covenant law. Aha, but you say, oh, Josh, what's the backup, right? If there's no real covenant law, we always turn to our friendly backup, which is the equitable servitude. Now, again, I don't think this touches and concerns the land, number two. And number one, you don't have intent from everyone. Perhaps they can bind their own properties, but they can't bind the 9 properties that were not subject to this promise. And then we get to the issue of notice. And this is where things get kind of weird, right? How would notice work in this case? Now, I suspect that the Shelley family, and by the way, I have a picture of them over here, 1 second, right? I suspect that the Shelley family knew about this restrictive covenant. And how do I know this? Because of the way they acquired it. They used a straw transaction, right? They had the prior owner sell it to a white person who then sold it to the Shelleys. Everyone saw that in the case? Right, that's a straw, straight up. And it was a straw designed to get around, hopefully people wouldn't notice that a Black family had bought the home. So I think they actual notice, right? But let's just pretend actual is not there, right? What would constructive notice look like in this case? Kind of weird. right? And this is kind of hinted at in the lower court opinion, but they don't say it quite overtly, right? So you go to a block, same way you go to in Sanborn, you look around, you see all residential properties, right? No gas stations. You go to the street, look around, you see any black families? That's what inquiry notice would actually look like here, right? If you look around and see everyone's white, would that mean you have constructive notice? That's a weird question to ask. Or more differently, these deeds were on the adjacent properties, right? Would you have noticed that if you're in the 1940s in St. Louis, they should probably check every single property to see if there's a restrictive covenant on there? Not everyone's got to check it. Some people have to check it, right, for black buyers. So it's a very from a property perspective, there's no way this case works, right? Again, there's no real covenant law. There's no touch and concern the land. I don't think the notice argument even works here because it's not usually how land is restricted. But the property argument sort of didn't matter, right? Why? The U.S. Supreme Court wanted to decide this case on the 14th Amendment grounds, set a national precedent, right? The court was trying to say, we are not going to allow the courts to implement these racial covenants anymore. That's what the upshot of this case is. Okay. Everyone sort of see the properties. We'll get to the common law issues in a moment. All right. So what happened here? Right. The lower court actually declined to enforce the covenant. And it was not because of the 14th Amendment, because again, Plessy was still good law. They said because not enough property owners signed off on the deed. You need to have everyone sign off on it. Okay. Is it ever going to be possible to have a person's property restricted if they don't sign off on it? The Missouri Supreme Court said the answer is yes. The Missouri Supreme Court seemed to say that we limit the agreement to those who signed it, and we can enforce the covenant even if not all the people signed it, only against those who signed it. And they also said that Shelley said constructive notice of the recorded agreement. Okay. Everyone with me? All right. Then the case goes upstairs to the Supreme Court. Okay. The court unanimously reverses majority opinion. Chief Justice Vincent wrote the majority opinion. You probably have one Vincent opinion in the entire case book for common law, which was Youngstown. He wrote a dissent. That's right. The only thing he ever saw justice. He lived a very short life. He lived only about 5 years. He lived 5 years. He was in the court for about 5 years. About 7 years. He had a heart attack. He died in office, and because he died, Earl Warren was appointed as Chief Justice, and of course that was everything. The irony: Earl Warren was Republican governor of California, and Eisenhower put him on the Supreme Court to prevent him from primarying him. Right? Eisenhower worried that Warren would primary him in the 1956 election. That didn't happen. And Warren did his thing for a while. Okay. And again, 3 justices, Reed, Jackson, and Rutledge, recused because they likely had restrictive covenants in their home. It didn't end there. When Chief Justice Rehnquist was going through his hearing in 1986, it turned out that he had a property, I think it was in Delaware, at the beach somewhere, that had a restrictive covenant on it. So these exist everywhere. A number of states are actually enacting statutes to allow people to remove the covenants from their houses, right, from their deeds. You might say, well, Josh, why do you need to remove it if they're not enforceable? Who the hell wants this on their deed, right? No, it's serious. It's a good question. Why would you want it? But then you say, well, Josh, can't they just remove it by themselves? No. How do you remove a covenant? You would need to have a release from the owner of the dominant estate. And if that's not forthcoming, the covenant stays. So even if the court will not enforce it, it's still on your deeds. So I know this was in Houston and some neighborhoods, and this is in other states. Special legislation is being passed to allow a person to apply to have the restrictive covenants wiped off their deeds. All right, so property professors are good for something. This was an idea that property professors have had for years and sort of going out to the forefront. All right, good. All right, so the Supreme Court's decision had 4 primary issues, right? The first one is state action doctrine still works. The mere existence of these restrictive covenants, right? The mere existence of these covenants does not violate the 14th Amendment, right? If people want to reach these racist agreements, they can do that, right? Without offending the 14th Amendment. Today, they cannot do that. It violates federal law, the Fair Housing Act. But back in 48, they could. That's only the first part of the analysis, right? The second part of the analysis says, okay, you're not just creating these agreements. You're asking the state judiciary to enforce the agreement. Okay? And the officers of the state are bound by the 14th Amendment. Therefore, the court could decide, did this covenant violate the 14th Amendment, or would it violate the 14th Amendment if state judicial officers enforced it? And the court said yes, right? The court recalled that the 14th Amendment was designed to ensure property rights to be enjoyed by all. And in particular, the court said that equal protection is not achieved through indiscriminate imposition of inequalities. Again, equal protection is not achieved through indiscriminate imposition of inequalities. At this time, Plessy was still the prevailing law, right? It was still the prevailing law. And you can see how the court's chipping away, right, at the separate but equal doctrine. And they sort of address this in an indirect way. The plaintiffs, the homeowners, the neighbors, the Kraemer said, wait a minute, there's no violation of protection. Why? In this neighborhood, white people said black people can't live there. And some other neighborhood, black people can exclude white people. Okay, right? So the court says, we're not aware of any such place that actually exists because it doesn't, right? But more importantly, any racial classification is unconstitutional. That is in direct violation of Plessy. Plessy said you have separate but equal. So already by the time you get to the late 1940s, the court is beginning to sort of chip away at the separate but equal doctrine. This was an important case along the way to Brown. All right. Questions on Shelley v. Kraemer? Very important case. It maybe should be in common law. I don't know which class it belongs in, but you get it here. No questions on Shelley? No? All right. Remember the property aspects of this case, though, because I mean, it's sort of a inconvenient truth that if you actually enforce common law property rules, Shelley wins here. The Missouri Supreme Court reversed the common law, which you say, oh, you reverse the common law. Well, it has effects, right? When you have common law rules that make it hard to enforce a covenant, you reverse those rules, and then you can enforce this racially restrictive agreement. So I don't think it's a covenant. I don't think it's an equal servitude. It's nothing. And therefore, I think, too bad. You can buy the house. All right, questions? All right, move on. All right, so we've talked about how to create covenants. And the next topic I want to discuss is how to terminate a covenant. And the book lists about 9 or 10 different criteria to terminate a covenant. And these are, I think, almost entirely identical to how to terminate an easement, right? So the same rules that are used to terminate an easement can be used to terminate covenant, right? So the most common, I say the most common, but one of the most common approaches, the first one is merger. Always remember the merger doctrine. I always ask about this in the exam. It always comes up, right? If the same person holds the dominant and servient tenement, again, the same person holds the dominant and the servient tenement, the easement dissolves, goes away, vanishes, poof, right? You can't covenant against yourself. So that's called the merger doctrine, right? The second option is what's called the release, right? If the owner of the dominant tenement releases the covenant, it goes away, which might sound very easy, but think about a subdivision with 100 lots, right? Again, in a subdivision with 100 lots, you have a mutually restrictive covenant. All 100 owners have to release their covenants. If any one of them keeps their covenant in place, you don't get rid of it. Which, going back to the issue of the racially restrictive covenants, it's not just enough to get one neighbor to release it. All the neighbors must release it. Okay? So a release has to be effectuated in writing by every single person who benefits from the easement. The covenant. All right. Number 3 is what's called acquiescence. Right. So let's say you have a lot zoned for resident. You have a lot with a covenant for residential, and someone builds a factory. and the factory's running for 10, 20, 30 years, and none of the neighbors enforce it. Then all of a sudden, the neighbors, aha, there's a factory. Let me go sue to stop it. There's a doctrine called acquiescence that if you fail to enforce your servitude against a breach, right, you can't try to enforce against someone else, right? If you fail to enforce after a while, you're probably not allowed to enforce against somebody else. The fourth one's called, yeah.
Is it accurate to say that the neighbors are in stop from enforcing?
It's a little different than estoppel, but it's related. Yeah. They're all really closely related. I'll get to estoppel in a few moments. There's also abandonment. So the classic example here is railroad. Like, let's say you have a covenant that allows a railroad to cross over Blackacre, and the railroad goes into business and they just leave their tracks there. At some point, the girls say this was an abandoned covenant. Okay. The fifth one, the unclean hands, is one you always sort of feel dirty about. Imagine that one person builds a factory in his lot, and his neighbor builds a factory and he sues his neighbor. It's like, oh, you can't do that, right? That you're doing the same thing you're complaining of, unclean hands.
I'm not super clear on the acquiescence abandonment distinction.
Acquiescence is if you see your neighbors violating it and you don't sue them for many years. That suggests you've sort of given into the agreement and you can't then enforce it against somebody else. Abandonment is where the person who has the covenant, who has the benefit, stops using it. So they're actually different. With acquiescence, the person who's burdened is using it, and with abandonment, they're not using it at all. No, there's no statute of limitation. In fact, that comes up with the next one, number 6, which is laches. L-A-C-H-E-S, not laches, it's pronounced latches. If you take too long to enforce your covenant, the court might not let you enforce it. Right? The term is unreasonable delay. That's not a specific number of years. There's no specific statutory limitation there. It's just you wait too long. Just not very satisfying, but that's the answer. Number 7 is, to Zach's point, estoppel. This is usually detrimental reliance, right? Where, imagine you have two neighbors and one says, hey, look, I know I have this covenant, but I really want to build a factory. Do you mind? No, you go ahead and build it, right? And then you rely on his promise. And then all of a sudden, the neighbor sues for building a factory. If there's some sort of detrimental reliance, the court may not enforce the covenant. The 8th one is eminent domain. If the government seizes your property through eminent domain, it wipes away the covenants. They're gone. The government gets a fee simple. It'll be very unusual for the government to let you have a covenant over them, as you control what the government does. That's just going to be very rare. The last one is the one which is subject to really both of our cases, say the changed circumstances doctrine. The changed circumstances doctrine. The rule generally is that if there's such a radical change in the circumstances, since when the covenant was created, there was a radical change in that time, the courts will not enforce it. A variant of this test concerns public policy, which comes up in the Northam case, right? That if the enforcement of a governmental or some covenant is against governmental policy, public policy, the courts will not enforce the covenant. But really, changed circumstances is sort of like the last chance, right? This is usually very hard to satisfy. The first case, the Batten case, illustrates how it's very hard to satisfy. But the Northam case is sort of an outlier. We'll get to that in a bit. All right, questions? Oh, one more point on the changed circumstances. Some states actually put a limitation period on covenants. I think Massachusetts says generally a covenant only lasts for 30 years. And the thinking there is land use needs to be flexible. And if you put a covenant in there, at some point, it will no longer make sense. Now, you'll probably ask me if the rule against perpetuities, right? I was waiting for your question, right? I was actually thinking about you when I prepped for class. It's awful, right? There is a restraint in alienation. And that's why these doctrines give a little bit of flexibility. But if you think about, the fee simple determinable, right? That exists forever. And those don't go away. I don't know if there's a similar doctrine that you can say, well, a fee simple determinable was created 300 years ago. Maybe the conditions have changed. The answer is too bad. Just deal with it. All right. All right. Who wants to give me the facts? Greg, want to give me the facts in Batten? Thank you.
I think you mentioned earlier the first paragraph is pretty complicated.
Yeah, the first few paragraphs were complicated and utterly irrelevant. So let's say there were 4 lots on the subdivision. That's it. So let's say there were 4 lots in the subdivision. Done. And then the rest of the case is easy.
And I think Wood owned
Correct.
20 lots and one of them fell for
Yeah.
commercial purposes.
Yeah, that's right. I'll come back to you in a moment. Right. There are all these corporations that also didn't matter. Right. Which corporation, which lot, none of it mattered. The phrase beneficial owner is one you might not be familiar with. A beneficial owner is a person who basically can control corporations. I think Wood and his wife controlled these various entities. I think that's what was going on there. I read the lower court opinion. It's still kind of unclear. All right, go on, Craig.
So the original lot, it was originally had a restricted covenant for residential purposes.
Mhm.
And Wood tried to remove that residential purpose, sell this 4 lots for commercial purpose.
Right.
He argued that.
What the neighbors do? So after it seems that Wood either announced or planned to do something commercial. What did the neighbors do?
Did they file an injunction against him?
Yeah, they sought to get an injunction against him.
Right.
Yeah, go on.
And then Wood argued that to have the covenant removed because of the changing circumstances of the neighborhood.
Good. All right, good. Thank you. Yeah. Another reason I don't like this case, it's so long and the payoff is so short.
I think the first 2 paragraphs are irrelevant.
Right. And even beyond that, there's just so much winding and talking, but the actual payout is very short. So you have this plot of land that was very large and it was built adjacent to Route 29. You ever been to Charlottesville? You ever been there? Anyway, so Charlottesville has grown significantly the last couple of decades. So it started off as like